Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. A man named Robert walks to his bank at 8 a.m. He has $340 saved, enough to cover rent for 5 months. The doors are locked. A handwritten sign on the window says, "Closed until further notice." He stands there. He reads it again. Then he turns and walks home to his wife and 3 children. His money is not coming back. There is no government insurance, no protection, no phone number to call. If your savings were held in a failed bank, too bad. Now Robert has $4 in his coat pocket, a full-time factory job he's about to lose, and a family who needs to eat in 3 days. Most people think they know what happened next. Breadlines, despair, men selling apples on street corners. But that is only half the story. There's another half, a quieter half. And it is the most important economic lesson nobody ever taught you. Some families, ordinary, unremarkable families on ordinary streets, did not fall apart. Not because they had savings. They did not. Not because the government helped them. It did not. Not for years, because of one thing, one skill. One way of thinking about money that the banks had been quietly training people to forget. That skill is what this video is about. And I promise you, by the end, you will understand your own finances differently than you did when you pressed play. Most people picture the 1929 crash as a Wall Street story. Bankers, stockbrokers, rich men crying. Here's the truth that history skips over. Only 16% of American households were invested in the stock market in 1929. 16%. That means 84% of Americans owned no stocks at all. They had nothing on Wall Street. They had never been to Wall Street. They had no idea what a margin call was. And yet, they lost everything too. Here is why. When stock prices collapsed, banks panicked. Banks had lent money to speculators. Those speculators could not pay it back. So the banks, to survive, started calling in every loan they had. Banks foreclosed on business and personal loans, pressuring customers to pay back their loans whether or not they had the cash. Farmers who had borrowed to buy equipment, shopkeepers who had borrowed to buy inventory, families who had borrowed to build homes, all of them. At once, pay up. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, there was a run on the banks where citizens took their money out, if they could get it, and hid their savings under mattresses, in bookshelves, or anywhere else they felt was safe. Then the banks themselves started closing, and here is the number that changes everything. Not 10 banks, not 100. By the time the crisis reached its depth, close to 9,000 banks had failed across America. Every cent in those banks, gone. Losses came directly from everyday individuals' savings, investments, and bank accounts. The country's gross national product declined by over 25% within a year, and wages and salaries declined by $4 billion. Unemployment tripled from 1.5 million at the end of 1929 to 4.5 million by the end of 1930. By 1932, nearly 25% of the nation's total workforce, 12.8 million people, were unemployed. Now, here's the question nobody asks. What did the other 75% do? The people who still had jobs watched their wages get cut in half. Wage income for workers who were lucky enough to keep their jobs fell 42.5% between 1929 and 1933. Half. So even people with jobs could not live on their jobs. Every single American family, everyone, had to find money from somewhere that was not a bank and not an employer. And they did. The question is not whether they survived. We know they survived. The question is how. Specifically, practically. What did they actually do on a Monday morning when the paycheck stopped? The answer is so practical and so specific that it should be taught in schools. But it is not. And here is why. The families who made it through 1929 and the years that followed shared one critical habit. They did not depend on one source of income. They never had. This sounds simple, but it is the most radical financial idea of the era, because the 1920s had spent 10 years training American families to do the opposite: buy things on credit, trust the bank, get a steady paycheck, let the professionals handle your money. Families rarely relied on a single source of income. Instead, they layered small earnings, selling eggs, taking in laundry, repairing items, or renting out space. Individually modest, together, these streams created stability. Let me give you specific numbers, because numbers are where this gets real. A woman named Clara in Cleveland. Her husband lost his factory job in early 1930. Their savings, $180, vanished when their bank closed that February. Clara took in laundry. The standard rate for laundry in the early 1930s was 5 cents per pound. The average family's weekly wash weighed about 18 pounds. That is 90 cents per family, per week. Clara took in 4 families' laundry, $3.60 a week. In 1930, a loaf of bread cost a nickel. 3 pounds of potatoes cost 9 cents. The average per capita income in 1929 was $750 a year, about $14 a week. Clara was making a quarter of that just from laundry. Was it glamorous? No. Did it keep the lights on and food on the table while her husband looked for work? Yes. But Clara was not just doing laundry. She was also doing something far more important. She was building something the banks could not take from her. She was building a reputation for showing up. In a neighborhood where cash had nearly disappeared, trust was the new currency. And the person everyone trusted to do what they said they would do, on time, with quality, became the person everyone came to when they needed something done. That reputation was worth more than a savings account, but laundry is only one piece. The families who truly thrived, who came out of the 1930s stronger than they went in, were running something much bigger than a laundry service. They were running an entire alternative economy right on their street. And the key to it was a skill that economists have a name for, but ordinary Americans in 1929 just called being useful. Here is something that will change how you think about money. When the formal economy collapsed in 1929, a different economy appeared. It had no banks, no credit, no stockbrokers, no interest rates. It ran entirely on skills and trust. In Seattle, community organizations advocated self-help production, setting up cooperatives to exchange products and services. Farmers donated food in exchange for labor. Carpenters, dentists, and seamstresses exchanged one kind of skill for another, dentists. That detail stops me every time I read it. A dentist in 1929, Seattle, who had lost most of his paying patients, did not close his practice and give up. He traded dental work for food, for firewood, for repairs to his office. His skill became his currency. This was not charity. It was not pity. It was a sophisticated economic transaction that worked because both parties had something the other needed, and neither of them needed a bank to complete it. When cash was limited, families exchanged goods and services directly. Food for repairs, labor for produce, sewing for childcare. Notice what is on that list: childcare. While men were out looking for work, and women were taking in laundry, sewing clothing, growing food, someone had to watch the children. And that someone who was willing to take 4 or 5 children for the day while their mothers worked was earning eggs, vegetables, mended clothes, firewood, things that kept a family alive. During the 1930s, practical abilities and knowledge created opportunity. A person who could repair shoes, sew clothing, forage for wild berries, or fix tools often found demand regardless of formal education. Tangible skills retain value because they solve immediate problems. Here is the pattern that jumps out of the historical record. The families who suffered most were the families who had only one income stream, one job, in one part of the formal economy. When that one thing went, they had nothing. The families who survived and even quietly prospered were the families who had 5 things going at once. None of them large, all of them based on skills other people needed, all of them building trust and reputation inside their own community. The bank could not close your garden. The bank could not repossess your skill with a needle and thread. The bank could not foreclose on your reputation as the person who fixed things. Now I want to show you the most surprising part of this story. The people who had the most money in 1929, who had invested the most, who had trusted the system the most, often fell the hardest. And the people who had the least, who had spent years learning to be useful to their neighbors because they had no other choice, often fell the softest. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern that repeats in every economic crisis in history. Let me tell you about the people who came through 1929 in the best shape. They were not the people you would expect. They were, overwhelmingly, rural families and small-town families who had never fully trusted the banks in the first place. In some ways, farmers were better off than city and town dwellers. Farmers could produce much of their own food, while city residents could not. Almost all farm families raised large gardens with vegetables and canned fruit from their orchards. They had milk and cream from their dairy cattle. Chickens supplied meat and eggs. They bought flour and sugar in 50-pound sacks and baked their own bread. They did not have cash, but they had food. And in 1930, food was worth more than cash. Here is something documented but rarely discussed. Outwork, performing labor for wages at home, became a popular way to add to family income. Many women took in the laundry of others for a fee. The women of 1929 and 1930 were, in many American families, the ones who held the income together when the formal paycheck disappeared, not because anyone gave them permission, not because the government stepped in, because they had skills, sewing, cooking, cleaning, preserving food, caring for children, that other people in their community were willing to pay for, even with very little money. In many Great Depression families, women were the only breadwinners. That sentence deserves to sit for a moment. The women who had been told for a decade that their domestic skills were not real work turned out to be the ones keeping American families alive. When the stock market proved that men in suits with briefcases and margin accounts had built a house of cards, and they did it not through one grand strategy, not through a government program, through dozens of small practical skills, or Each one modest, each one reliable, each one solving a specific problem a neighbor had. Now, here is the specific thing these families understood, the thing that is the actual 1929 skill. The people who made it through the bank closures of 1929 shared one understanding: money is not wealth. Money is a representation of value. And value can exist without money. This sounds abstract, but the families who lived it understood it concretely. The woman who could preserve 40 jars of vegetables was not sitting on worthless jars. She was sitting on 40 units of food security that she could eat, trade, sell, or give to a neighbor and earn trust that would come back to her in winter. The man who could repair a shoe with a leather scrap and a good needle was not doing charity. He was providing a service that in 1930 was more reliably available than buying a new pair of shoes, because new shoes cost money nobody had, and shoe repair cost whatever you could spare. The mechanic who knew how to keep a 1927 Ford running did not lose his value when the market crashed. He gained it. Because cars that had been running fine in 1928 were suddenly going to need to run for 10 more years, because nobody could buy a new one. Skills that once felt optional, like sewing, repairing, gardening, cooking from scratch, suddenly became economic assets. The 1929 skill is this: know how to do things that other people need done. More than one thing, not just your job, not just your specialty. Enough things that when one source of value dries up, you have 4 others waiting. And build your reputation for doing those things reliably and well inside the community closest to you. Because when the formal economy broke in 1929, what held communities together was not the government, which did almost nothing useful until 1933. It was not the banks, which were the problem. It was the person on your street who showed up when they said they would, did what they said they could do, and accepted payment in whatever form you had available. That person became the center of a neighborhood economy that the stock market crash could not touch. Now here is the part I want you to sit with. The specific conditions that made 1929 so devastating have not gone away. Unemployment tripled in the first year after the crash. By 1932, approximately 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. Today, economists at J.P. Morgan estimate a 40% chance of a global recession in 2026 in household debt. A third of Americans say they could not survive 1 month without a paycheck. The underlying conditions are different. The underlying vulnerability is familiar, but here is what is also different. The skills that protected families in 1929, repair, food production, practical service, community trust, have largely disappeared from everyday American life. We do not repair things. We replace them. We do not grow food. We buy it from a supply chain that crosses 3 continents. We do not build reputations in our neighborhoods. We do not know our neighbors' names. The 1929 families were not special. They were not survivalists. They were not preppers in the modern sense. They were just people who had not yet been fully trained to depend on a single system for everything. And that, right there, is the gap between them and us. Now, there is one more piece to this story that I have not told you yet. The families who built these neighborhood economies, who layered their income, who traded skills, who grew food and repaired things, they did something that took the lessons of 1929 and turned them into permanent generational wealth. Not gold, not silver, not stocks. Something much simpler and much harder to take away. That is the next video. Subscribe, because what comes next is the part of this story that every financial channel somehow misses. I will see you there.